Good morning, this is Dr. Kali again, and this is video 14 of the coronavirus pandemic Terminator series. And we had covered until slide 64, and I'll see if there is any recap needed. The brief recap was, so we talked about how the brain synchronizes in forces beyond our usual calculation of visual or auditory clues. And that particular phenomena also happens in terms of stock markets, also happens in large organizations. And to enforce or reinforce that kind of group thinking, the primatologists have studied this phenomena very well. There is intimidation used to enforce conformity to the group thinking or the commonly held wisdom. And we have already mentioned Jane Goodall, who got me interested in this work many decades back. And I have already mentioned Dr. Robert Sapolsky from Stanford, who has done probably the most elegant work in studying primate behavior in terms of his field animals were baboons. And I highly recommend looking at his work as well. So this is the kind of model that's floating around in the scientific circles. There are about 7 billion people on this planet. And in worst case scenario, as much as 80% of the world's population could become infected. And that's approximately 5.6 billion people. And some models predict there could be as much as 1% mortality, and that would be about 56 million people dead around the world. And in scenarios that are a little more pessimistic than that, mortality could be as high as 2 or even 3%. 3% seems unlikely because the denominator of the equation of number of people tested is probably not accurate. So 2% still is a fairly high mortality, and that's 120 million people dead around the world. By using that calculation in the United States, the mortality could be from 2.4 million to 4.8 million people. And as of March 23rd, 2030, the devastation has already been horrendous. Stock markets are down 30%, trillions of dollars of wealth has evaporated, whole industries have been decimated. But in my estimation, all the scientific models we develop can never take all the variables into account. And those of you who are familiar with a branch of mathematical calculation called multivariate analysis, those of us who have worked with that particular mathematical modeling know that the number of variables that we can keep into account for mathematical calculation that we can predict are always limited. As time passes on, we find out the limitations of those modeling. So our 1 to 2% mortality and somewhere from 56 to 112 million people mortality around the world could be totally wrong, and I anticipate that multiple other interventions would intervene, and of course I intend to slowly walk you to that intervention and hope to mitigate this coronavirus pandemic in its worst form and suppress that curve, that the peak that has been floating around on TV and on internet. That peak quickly does, and the hope is that we kind of bring it down. And in this particular scenario, when you follow the standard advice, I feel like in common linguistics saying the Rome is burning, and clearly with this coronavirus pandemic, Rome is burning. But by giving people this minimalist advice of 6 feet away, and then letting them come into crowded areas like grocery stores and shopping centers, I feel like our collective wisdom is letting people unintentionally pour gasoline on the fire, and there are going to be a lot more people getting contaminated by this method, especially in light of the fact that for as long as up to 24 days, but even up to 10 days, there are asymptomatic people walking around, and their nasal mucosal passages are evaporating water particles, and as those water particles are being expelled out, so are the viral particles being expelled out. And the picture I showed of a crowded shopping area, all that air is going to be contaminated, and until we account for it, this is going to be an unmitigated disaster. I feel like I'm the only guy with a bucket of water and pointing to the Mediterranean Sea, where more water is available, but nobody seems to be listening. Everybody keeps pouring more gasoline on the fire and keeps expecting a different results. And this surgical mask and N95, this minimally effective protection that is being offered to the healthcare workers in face of contaminated air with lethal viral particles, in my mind, would show the scientific blind spot based on which this advice is being given. And I have challenged this in as polite diplomatic language as I can, and I'll continue doing that. And again, this is just a recap of that blind spot. And I've already gone over this thought process of indoor contaminated air. And since I happen to have practiced medicine for about 28 years and have people coming into my exam room coughing and contaminated my desktop and keyboard of my desktop computer and my the top surface of my desk, I've had about 28 years to think about the flaw in this thinking. And fortunately, most people who used to come into my exam room usually had some kind of a cold virus or a rhinovirus or a coronavirus causing the usual kind of colds. And most of the time it was not a big problem. However, most of the influenza vaccines were never 100% effective. So I always worried about that. And of course, other airborne diseases like tuberculosis. So I had seen this flaw for 28 years, and that flaw, unfortunately, is being magnified by coronavirus 100 million fold. So the doctors' exam rooms, the ER waiting rooms, doctors' offices, industrial manufacturing floors, grocery checkout counters, cash registers, card readers at the grocery checkout counters, and other surface areas at grocery checkout counters are going to become contaminated, and it is going to be impossible to clean after a contaminated air touches all these surfaces. So this reliance on cleaning again and again is not going to be useful. And again, I don't want to sound alarmist. However, unless you think through all the scientific possibilities, you are going to keep giving advice to people on suboptimal informations. So let's think of contaminated air in a grocery store. That contaminated air, or in a restaurant where there is a buffet or food is being cooked. If you have contaminated air with contaminated lethal viral particles touching the food surface, and it's not like after I come home and start eating food, after every bite I touch the food, I can go dip my hand in chlorine surface. So that's not practical. So the surface of the food particles, just think of a lettuce head which is going to be contaminated. Once the head of lettuce is contaminated, you cut that and make it into a salad or the tomatoes. Essentially, all those surfaces are contaminated, and whether you take a fork and put that in your mouth, invariably, sooner or later, that food contamination is going to touch your hands. And these hands, I don't care what you say, sooner or later are going to touch your nasal mucosal passages, and sooner or later, you are going to do this to your eyes because we are all in the habit of doing this. And I saw the secretaries or the ministers of health criticizing each other in Singapore. And I was thinking, that sounds nice in theory on TV, but in real life, that's not a practical advice. So we might have to think of our food supply itself being a source of infection. Then the question has to be people like me who have education and scientific understanding when they give this kind of alarmist advice, well, what is their treatment or solution to the problem? The solution or the treatment of the problem might be to eat canned food for a few months until this whole thing settles down. And when you bring these cans of food from the grocery store, leave them out in the garage and maybe dip them in highly concentrated bleach, rinse them out off with the with the water from the faucet outside, and then let them dry up for 2-3 days and then bring them into the kitchen. And at this point, that sounds like an alarmist thought, but let's keep our eyes open to see if that would be necessary, because there hasn't been any scientific testing done from the food on buffet if there are viral particles on there on a food buffet in a restaurant, or the head of lettuce or tomatoes in a grocery store if they have contaminated viral particles. And if they are a source of infection, they need to be addressed. And no science is in yet. However, this is my scientific thinking as I'm thinking in terms of contaminated air. And we'll certainly discuss this in more detail if this actually turns out to be a source of contamination. And then the question becomes, what do you use? You have to use those hands to pick up those cans of canned food. At this point, we do not have any proper equipment that you can use. The regular rubber gloves are not made for picking up cans of 2-pound or 4-pound or 5-pound cans of food, and they very easily tear. However, right now that's the best we have, and special rubber gloves can be used for picking up these contaminated cans. However, what I have in mind is a special kind of a rubber glove that you can wear for 8 hours, and that glove you can, if you have a tub or a container of bleach, you can dip your gloves while wearing them on your hands. Then the outside of your gloves becomes sterilized with bleach, and then you can rinse your hands in water. And then after that, you can take your gloves off. And we'll talk about that in a little while. And we already mentioned about that we might have to eat canned food for a while. And since we are already about 13 minutes into this, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording for the time being, and then we'll pick up from slide 70 on to video 15 again. This is the conclusion of video number 14.